Hello, so here we go with part 3 of revision for self-death and afterlife. Have a look at parts 1 and 2 if you haven't already, otherwise this won't make a huge amount of sense. So in this part of the video, I'm going to take you through the final bit of the topic, which is focused on the possibility of continuing personal existence after death. Now, this is a little bit different than just religious ideas about life after death. So we're not really talking about things like heaven and hell. We're talking more in a philosophical sense about whether it even makes sense to talk about the idea that something of ourselves could continue after death. So this is related to the discussion I had in part 2 about the relationship between the body and the soul. So we're asking, if something can survive the death of the body, what is that and how would that work? So a couple of exam questions that could be the sort of thing that comes up. Examine arguments in favour of personal existence continuing after death. That could also be flipped and be examine arguments against that. Belief in continuing personal existence after death is not reasonable. That's a very kind of straightforward route 1 15-mark question for you there on this topic. Now, probably more so than anywhere else in the rest of the topic, there's loads and loads and loads of scholars that come up in this part of the content, but none of them can be used in questions. I don't think they'd use Descartes in a question particularly on this bit of the content. That's more likely to be about dualism and the nature of the soul, or the relationship between the body and the soul. Continuing personal existence after death, you can talk about people like Hick, Swinburne, Dennett, Parfit, Russell. There's loads you can talk about, but they won't appear in questions. That's not to say you can get away without knowing any of them. I would try and make sure that you've got at least a bit on all of them so that you can use those bits in your answer, because you can get really, really good credit for talking about them. It's just that you can't be asked about them directly. Hope that makes sense. So here we go. First up, we've got physicalist and materialist views. Now, we know more or less what these are because I talked about physicalism and materialism in part 2. So this is to do with the idea that all matter is just physical. So essentially we have no soul. So to what extent can we survive death? Can we move on into another life as ourselves? If you're a physicalist, there's really no extent to which you can do that, because a person's identity is inextricably linked to their body, and you can't live on without your body. So it's quite hard for most people to imagine themselves completely separate than their body, because your body is how you interact with the world, it's how you experience the world. Your brain is part of your body and everything goes through your brain. So it's very, very hard to take the body out of the equation. Bertrand Russell said that we fear death, we don't like death, we don't want to die, so we hope that there is an afterlife and that our identity, our self, will survive there in some way. But he didn't think that this idea of a fixed identity was really true. He thought that in reality we're just a collection of experiences, we're changing all the time. There is no kind of very fixed us. A little bit Buddhist in that sense, really. But his point is basically we can't survive death because there's nothing to survive death. Flew, who you will probably remember from the falsification principle, said we can't even talk about this meaningfully. We can't do it coherently, because to do it we would have to talk about surviving death or dead survivors, and that kind of language is self-contradictory, and if it's self-contradictory it's not meaningful, we can't get anywhere with it. What all these guys have in common is that they're probably right about this point. There is no way that we have at the moment to prove any sort of life after death using empirical evidence. So everything we've studied about brains and bodies suggests that when brain activity ceases, that's the point of death. There can't really be anything after that. If there is, it's not something that we can find using any kind of physical tests that we have at the moment. All right, let's talk about Hick for a minute. So John Hick crops up in lots of places in the course. You'll be familiar with his thinking. He did a thought experiment called Replica Theory. Now, the thing where people get confused with Replica Theory is they think that it's actually Hick's argument for what happens after death, and then they get confused because they've thought about Hick saying everybody goes to heaven and universal salvation. So let's just be clear about this. I don't think Hick is saying replica theory is actually what happens. He's doing it as a thought experiment to show that if there is an omnipotent God, it is possible that we could be physically resurrected somewhere else. I think that's all he's trying to say. So he's saying that an omnipotent God could make a replica of you at the exact moment of your death in another world, and it would be absolutely identical to you in every way. So you would die on Earth, and at the instant moment of your death, God could create a perfect replica of you in a resurrection world. Hick's point is, if God is omnipotent, God can do that. There's no logical problem in saying that he could do that. But you could ask the question, if something like this happens, is a replica you the same as the real you? Because the real you, the you that has always been, is on Earth and they are dead. So would a replica in heaven or a resurrection world or wherever else you want to call it, would that really be you? And if it isn't, if it's just a replica, however perfect it may be, is it really continuity of personal existence? We can link this to resurrection in general from Christianity. Now, Christians may believe in resurrection after death because the New Testament talks about it, St. Paul talks about it at length, and we've also got Jesus's own resurrection. Now, if we take that very literally and say that Christians believe that people are literally raised to life after death, this is what St. Augustine seemed to think would happen, we can quite easily take that down using scientific evidence, because we've got tons and tons and tons of evidence that once people die, they tend to stay dead. We don't have any scientific evidence really to say that the opposite happens. All we've got is the story of Jesus' resurrection, and it may just be a story. We weren't there. We can't know. A lot of Christians take more of a spiritual understanding of the concept of resurrection, though, and that might include St. Paul, because he talks about earthly bodies and spiritual bodies. So he seems to be hinting there that if we live on after death, it's not in our original bodies, it's something different. Now, we can't get massively further with what he did mean, but it's possible that he's moving away from this very easy to contradict idea that people are simply brought back to life as Jesus was in the stories. All right, next up we've got consciousness. So consciousness is difficult. We've talked about it in the other parts of the video. We don't absolutely know what it is. And so that opens up the possibility that it could exist after death. If we can't absolutely pin down what it is, then surely we don't know exactly how it behaves. Now, Plato believed a version of this. He thought that the soul or the mind, or what we might now call the consciousness, lives on in the world of the forms after death. There's a guy called H.H. Price who believes that the afterlife is all mind-based. So it's a little bit like a dream world. So in the afterlife, Price puts forward the idea that there's no need for a body, and disembodied souls or minds communicate by telepathy. So you don't need a body. The afterlife is completely different than this life, and a body would be unnecessary because different souls can communicate in a completely different way. Swinburne's got an argument that's a little bit like Hick's. He argues that existence after death is logically possible for God to bring about, because all the mind would need is something to do the function that the brain did in life. And an omnipotent God could provide this. And he used an analogy of a light bulb. If you switch off the light bulb, it won't work. But all you need to do to get it to work again is to turn the power back on. So he thinks some sort of version of that could be a possibility, and an omnipotent God could do it. But all of these arguments have got a problem because they're all dualistic. And we can use the same criticisms we used against people like Descartes and dualism in general to take these down, because fundamentally we don't have any evidence that there's a separation upon death of body and mind, body and soul, body and consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And if the brain runs everything, then it's very, very hard to imagine consciousness being able to exist outside of the brain, which is what we would have to imagine. Okay, reincarnation and NDEs. Now, NDE stands for near-death experience. So we'll take these together. Reincarnation is a very, very interesting one. It's a very old idea. It's been around in faiths such as Hinduism for thousands and thousands of years. And it's quite a simple, elegant belief in some ways. The idea that when somebody dies, the soul is reborn in a new body. So souls are eternal, bodies aren't. And there is some evidence for this. There's been studies done. There's sort of young children who are able to remember past lives. They can sort of point to people and places to which they've never been, but they can remember them and describe them in detail. People have been led to recall past lives under hypnosis. For many people, that's quite convincing. And reincarnation is, you might argue, just as reasonable a belief as Christian beliefs in resurrection. But this research needs to be taken with a pinch of salt in some ways, because some of the methods weren't amazing. Anything that relies on the testimony of children is perhaps a little bit, not suspect, but you can't absolutely draw strong conclusions from it. Near-death experiences are a slightly different thing. Now, these are common in nearly all cultures, and they've got a lot of common features. So you probably know a little bit about these. You might have looked at some examples. It could be someone is maybe very, very ill at a point where they're very close to death, and they have sort of a feeling of a bright light, being pulled down a tunnel, seeing maybe dead relatives, feeling a sense of great peace and love, and then maybe a sense that they're being told it's not their time, and then they're sent back in some way. A lot of those experiences are very common. But what you've got to remember is that people who are having these experiences, they're close to death, but they're not actually dead. So what we don't have is anyone who has actually been genuinely dead and has been able to come back and talk about it. In pretty much every case of near-death experiences, there are a few that slightly defy these parameters, but generally speaking, people have still had brain activity, they've still had a heartbeat, they've still been breathing, even if it's been done by a machine for them because they're being resuscitated or they're in a coma. So they're not actually dead. So we can say that's not that useful for talking about life after death. A modern take on continuity of personal existence is the idea that what if there's a psychological element to this? So what if maybe our thoughts can continue after death, even if our bodies don't or our souls don't? And we've got two possibilities here. We've got something called bundle theory from Derek Parfit. This is the idea that there isn't any such thing as a self. We're just a bundle of states of being. Essentially, we're just a combination of all the things that have happened to us, and that's us. So there isn't a fixed self. There isn't anything that could survive death in that way. Because we're just a bundle of states and everyone else is also a bundle of states, we continue to have an influence for as long as we are remembered. So after we die, People who love us remember us, people who knew us remember us, the work we did lasts for a certain amount of time, and this is as close as we can get to continuity of personal existence. Daniel Dennett's got a different idea. He thinks more in terms of computers, and he's got the idea that in theory, everything that happens in your brain is essentially data, and one day we might be able to store this and run it on a different platform, like a computer. So, I mean, this is a massive oversimplification of Dennett's view, but what if, I think he's saying, you could maybe save all of your thoughts and memories and experiences onto something like a very, very advanced USB stick and run that on a different platform after you're gone. So in that way, your psychological self, for want of a better phrase, would be preserved and you would be continuing to exist after death. But we can ask questions about both of these. Can thoughts and ideas exist without a thinker? So do we actually need the self in order to make this meaningful? And would it really count as continuation of the self? In other words, would it really be you? Can't answer those questions, but it's worth asking them. Okay, finally, we're going to circle back to something that you've done in another area of the course, which is process theology. And we're going to look at this idea of objective immortality. Now, this has come up before. God and the universe exist panentheistically, which means God is in the universe and the universe is in God. There's no separation. So because everything that exists is therefore existing in this very tied up relationship with God, when those entities die, process theology argues that everything lives on in the mind of God. So everything is remembered by God because it existed as part of God. But there's no sense of personal identity continuing separately. There's no heaven. There's no separate place that you go after death. Now, we might be able to make this work with something like dual aspect monism, which, if you remember, says that we are one substance, but we experience ourselves in two ways. So mind activity and brain activity can be understood separately. But is survival after death meaningful if we're not aware it's happening? So if we just are remembered by God, you might think, well, that's very nice, but I don't really still exist. I'm not aware of myself anymore. So can we really say that that's continuing personal existence? And also the big religious problem with this is most Christians reject the process view of God because in the process view of God, God is not omnipotent. And that's a big, big sticking point for certainly many Christians who believe God has to be omnipotent. Okay, so we're there with that. Thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to leave questions, comments. I know the exam's getting close now, so I'll try to reply to them as quickly as I can. All the best, and I'll see you soon.